Good afternoon. It is October 4th, 2020, and this is episode 34 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. With the country ramping up for what looks to be a showdown over a possible Supreme Court justice nomination, I thought it would be good to take a couple of episodes and go through some facts and trivia about the Supreme Court of the United States, otherwise known as SCOTUS. At the very top, I'm sure if you've watched any sort of news recently, you have seen the building that is the home of the Supreme Court. It is simply known as the Supreme Court Building or the Supreme Court of the United States. It is located at 1 First Street Northeast in Washington, D.C. Now, along with everything else in Washington, D.C., you probably think, oh, hey, it's been there for a long time, like the White House and the Capitol. But like we talked about in a previous episode, not every president has lived in the White House and not every justice has served in the Supreme Court building. In fact, for the first 145 years of its existence, the Supreme Court did not have a home. The court actually convened for the first time in 1790 in New York City, the same place where George Washington was living at the time, and it was the nation's capital in ways. From 1791 until 1800, it was housed in Philadelphia, after George Washington moved the capital to Philadelphia. It was during this time that Washington, D.C. itself was under construction, but there was no separate home envisioned for the Supreme Court. In fact, the court was planned to be housed inside the Capitol itself, and that's where it stayed for more than 100 years after 1800 at various locations within the Capitol building. But with the expansion of the country, and therefore the expansion of the Congress, it became necessary for the court to move around pretty often, and that was inconvenient. In 1929, at the urging of the Chief Justice, money was set aside to actually build a permanent home in Washington, D.C. for the Supreme Court. In 1935, the Supreme Court building opened, and the court has been held there ever since. Now, there are some unique facets about the building. If you've ever been there in Washington, D.C., it has a very long staircase leading up to the front of the building. There are statues all around. It's built in the same Greco-Romanesque style as most of Washington, D.C. But once you're inside, there are, in fact, a few differences. Number one, it has a basketball court on the top floor. And in fact, that court is nicknamed the highest court in the land. It also has a gym made famous with its use by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the recently departed justice. And essentially, the entire building is there to serve the needs of the justices and their requests. For instance, Justice Kagan was the one to have a froyo machine first installed in the cafeteria. But at the request of justices, any number of changes can be made to the building. Throughout the building, there are offices on several floors. As the justices age, sometimes they will shift offices to give those justices who are a little older offices that are more accessible. They do vary in size, and there is some fights over the size of the offices and who should get them based on seniority, but oftentimes these are all very distinguished jurists, and it's more a matter of convenience than it is anything else. And speaking of convenience, there is only one rule in the highest court of the land, and that is no lifting weights and no playing basketball while court is in session. There is one other very unique topic about the building itself. Within the walls of the Supreme Court building, there is a copy of the Ten Commandments etched into a wall. It was made very clear from the opening of the building that the Ten Commandments are not there to establish any sort of religious precedent, but rather as an example of overarching law that we should all hold ourselves accountable to. And in fact, in various places around the building, having been there myself, there are other examples of ancient laws, maybe not etched in stone like the Ten Commandments, but placed there as a reminder that we are all equal under the law. And in fact, those words adorn the very entrance of the building. One other interesting factoid about the Supreme Court building, something you just don't see when we're talking about government projects, it came in under budget. In 1932, Congress had appropriated $9,740,000 for the construction and establishment of the Supreme Court building. They had brought in one of the best architects in the world. His name was Cass Gilbert, and he was actually the architect for the Woolworth Building, that from 1913 until 1930 was the world's tallest skyscraper. The Chief Justice at the time of the laying of the cornerstone said, They were setting about to create a building of dignity and importance suitable for its use as the permanent home of the Supreme Court of the United States. And I think you can agree that they did. After the building was completed, they set about to actually furnish it. And at the end of all of the appropriations, they had already come in under budget, although the designers expected they would need additional appropriation for the furniture, for the bench, and for everything that the justices might need. And in fact, again, an oddity in government, $94,000 was returned to the U.S. Treasury at the completion of the project. In the next episode, we're going to turn to the justices themselves and talk a little bit about the men and women who have held that seat. I'll look forward to seeing you then. Good afternoon. It is October 5th, 2020, and this is episode 35 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. Thanks for joining me. I'm Rob. Last episode, we talked about the Supreme Court building, the home of the Supreme Court of the United States. But this time around, let's talk about the justices who work inside that building. First things first, what does it take to be a justice? Well, the simple fact is that the Constitution holds no rules on who may be a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. While being in Congress has an age restriction and being president has an age restriction, and in fact being president also has a restriction on citizenship, there are no such restrictions for the Supreme Court. The only restriction is that they must be nominated by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate, which we now read to be confirmation by the Senate, as a check and balance on that branch of government. Throughout the history of the court, there have been 113 justices and chief justices. Now, there are two types. Associate justices are what now would make up the 8 of the 9 members of the court. And then there is the Chief Justice, the center, the one who is the named member of the court. Currently, we are in the Roberts Court because the Chief Justice is John Roberts. Historically, of those 113 justices, 57% of them actually never had their Juris Doctorate. Now, that is not strange considering that law schools were a rarity in the Americas in the early years, and oftentimes men would just train with a lawyer and then pass the bar. Currently, the Ivy League is dominating the Supreme Court. 5 of the justices were enrolled at Harvard, 3 attended Yale, and 1 graduated from Columbia. And it is true that Harvard has produced the most Supreme Court justices at 15. And that number is more than the next 3 law schools combined: Yale, Columbia, and Samford. No, not Stanford. The school Samford. The youngest Chief Justice of the court was John Jay. The youngest Associate Justice ever appointed was 32-year-old Joseph Story. On the other end of the spectrum, the oldest serving justice was Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who served until he was 90 years old, and he retired. He did not die on the court. Although there have been a wide variety of terms on the court, and in the first years of the court, justices served much shorter terms than they have recently. On average, a justice will serve 16 years on the court. John Marshall was the longest serving Chief Justice at 34 years, 5 months. And Associate Justice William Douglas is the longest serving justice of any kind at 36 years and 7 months. Now, while there are no official qualifications to be on the court, there are also no qualifications of the court. There's a lot of debate going on recently about the number of justices and whether or not a 6-3 majority going in either political direction may sway the court and sway the future of the country. But that 6-3 majority is kind of moot. When the court was created, it had 6 justices, 5 associates, and a Chief Justice. Later, that number was increased to 7. In 1837, that number was bumped up to 9, and in 1863, it rose to 10. In both cases, that number was set to match the number of appellate jurisdictions in the federal court system. In 1866, that number shrunk back to 7. But 3 years later, in 1869, that number was raised back to 9. And ever since then, it has stood at 9. But you can see that there have been a lot of differences in numbers. And the controversy comes from what some might call a court packing scheme. In the 1930s, President Roosevelt asked Congress to change the law surrounding the Supreme Court to add an additional justice for everyone who served past the age of 70. So essentially, if there was 9 justices and 4 of them were older than 70, the president could then appoint 4 more. And as those older justices died off or retired, no new justices would replace them until more justices reached the age of 70, and then whoever was in office at the time could add additional justices at that time. This would make the number on the court kind of a rotating and an uncertain number, or it may encourage those who are a little older to retire. The idea behind this was, in fact, a court packing scheme to get younger-minded people, New Deal-minded people, onto the court. But it isn't necessarily a bad idea. We find a lot of entrenchment in older people who are in government, and perhaps getting some younger blood, some younger life in all three areas of our government, the executive, the legislature, and the judicial, may help us move into a more progressive future. And why was that court packing scheme necessary? Well, because justices serve for life. There is no term, and they don't have to run at any certain point. They can retire, they may die in office, and they can be impeached. But over the history of the United States, only one justice has ever been impeached. And by that, of course, he was impeached by the House and then acquitted by the Senate, and he retained his seat for one additional year until he died while on the court. That justice was Samuel Chase, and it happened in 1804. So it's been some time since that has been an issue. George Washington had the most appointments to the Supreme Court at 11. As I said, in the early years of the Republic, the justices served much shorter terms. Jimmy Carter had the least number of appointments with 0. And in fact, he is the only president to serve a full term who didn't appoint anyone. There are two others, Zachary Taylor, who only served for 16 months, and William Henry Harrison, who only served a few months, who both neither appointed any Supreme Court justices. To date, there have been 160 nominations, including the nominations of a Chief Justice, wherein someone who's already on the court may be moved to the Chief Justice spot. And of that total, 124 were confirmed. 7 of them opted not to take the job at some point, meaning they backed out of the nomination, and these have been spread across the entire history of the country. However, John Tyler, who took office after William Henry Harrison died, actually stands with the record of nominating 9 justices to the court and only confirming 1. He was extremely unpopular. That same law that increased the number of people on the court to 9 in 1869 also started the process of whittling away the cases that the court would hear. In the 30s, that was finally turned over and given the court's discretion, meaning that the Supreme Court gets to decide what cases they hear, and now they follow what's called the Rule of 4, meaning if at least 4 justices agree to hear a case, then it will be heard. 10,000 applications are made to the court to hear cases every year, and only about 80 are actually heard. Some really interesting and really terrifying facts to close out the episode here. On the interesting side, Justice Byron White is not only a member of the Supreme Court, but he was nominated to the College Football Hall of Fame and the NFL Hall of Fame, and is members of both. The first Catholic justice was Roger B. Taney. The first Jewish justice was Louis Brandeis. The first African-American justice was Thurgood Marshall. The first Hispanic justice, and this I cannot believe, is Sonia Sotomayor, who is still currently on the court. And the first female justice was Sandra Day O'Connor. One fact that I'm sure everyone is aware of now is that Justice Ginsburg beat cancer. The fact I saw was twice, but I believe it was more often than that. It may have been 3 times. But she beat cancer while on the Supreme Court several times and did not miss a day of work. And to the unfortunate factoid, there is a member of the Supreme Court who is also a member of the Ku Klux Klan. That was Justice Hugo Black. However, he later joined the majority in Brown versus Board of Education, which ended public school segregation. So it might be a wash. Kinda. Finally, there are 20 quill pens placed at the bar where the attorneys sit at every oral argument. Of course, these quill pens are not used. There's no ink to use them in. However, the attorneys are encouraged to take them with them as souvenirs for arguing before the court. It is rare that an attorney gets an opportunity to argue in front of the Supreme Court. Justice Ginsburg made several arguments over the course of her legal career before the court before joining it. And that is the case with many Supreme Court justices. They argue before the court before joining the court. But it is oftentimes that a lawyer will have one opportunity ever to argue a case before the Supreme Court. So hopefully you'll walk away from this episode with not just a better understanding of the Supreme Court building and the Supreme Court itself, but an understanding on why these nominations are so important and why they can cause such strife. Good afternoon. It is October 6th, 2020, and this is episode 36 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. I was recently adding some movies to my watch list for my movie review podcast, which is the Everyman Movie Review. You can find that on Anchor as well. And I realized that there were some really great movies from the last couple of years that I had not seen and thought it would be worthwhile to see. One of these was The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. And I don't know, I saw the cover of the movie and it got me to thinking about the outfits that people were wearing and just kind of Westerns as a whole. And I think the movie industry has tried in the last few years to get things a little more accurate, historically speaking. Maybe not all parts of the movie industry. We had Pocahontas in the 90s, which is essentially a fictional story of the story of Pocahontas, but we'll save that for another day. Today I wanted to talk about the Wild West and how it was really more likely the mild West. Now, there wasn't a lot of civilization in the West. That is actually pretty true. Basically, wherever the railroad decided to put a stop, a town would spring up around that railroad stop, and most of these towns weren't places for most of the citizens of the United States at the time. They were very rough. There weren't streets. Often there weren't even sidewalks. What you've seen in movies and on TV can be accurate in that portrayal. If it rained, basically everything turned into mud, and the mud got everywhere, and it might take a long time to get it off of you. And there wasn't a lot of bathing. But to be honest, at that period, there wasn't a lot of bathing anywhere in the world. And often we're built these worlds of expansive towns out in the West, and that just wasn't the case. Oftentimes, it would just be a row of houses and shops that lined the railroad tracks that kind of centered around the railroad station itself. Sometimes this would move off in a direction parallel to the railroad tracks and then also perpendicular too. But these towns weren't really that big. And the idea that they were lawless is kind of true. Oftentimes, it would take a while for the town to be large enough to have a tax base that would support a sheriff or a police force in the town. So there often wasn't a police force, and in that way, I suppose they were lawless, but it wasn't as if there were crimes happening all the time. We often imagine that these Western towns just had shootouts daily and bodies piling up, but that wasn't the case. Now, you could say that they are far more violent than the cities of today. In 1980, there were 515 murders in Miami, a city that at the time had 1.5 million people. This made the homicide rate 32.7, which is extremely high. It was the highest homicide rate in the nation. Now, compare that to Dodge City in 1880. In 1880, Dodge City had a murder rate of 1 in 996, which is essentially an actual rate of 100.4. Now that sounds extremely violent and dangerous, but Miami in 1980 had 1.5 million people and 500 murders. In 1880, Dodge City had 996 people and 1 murder. In fact, all throughout Kansas Territory, throughout that period, cities like Abilene, Caldwell, Dodge City, Ellsworth, Wichita, all of those train stop cities averaged about 3 deaths a year, 3 murders a year. And you remember that insane shootout at the OK Corral from Arizona Territory? 3 deaths. And they were the only 3 deaths recorded in that town in that year. And what about those outlaws that just went around robbing banks all over the West? Well, there were about 8 bank robberies recorded in the entirety of the Wild West from 1859 to 1900. It just wasn't a common occurrence. I mean, in the end, the bank wasn't the place where you would find the money most of the time anyway. That isn't to say that Western Union mail carriers and the like weren't robbed pretty often by outlaws, that trains weren't robbed. That did occur. And it isn't to say that there weren't things called outlaws. In fact, there were a lot of outlaws and outlaw bands. But for the most part, these were people that they didn't want to live by the standards of society. They didn't live in town. They didn't farm. They lived outside of what you might consider normal life. And a lot of times they hid in Indian territory, this, of course, being the derogative term for Native Americans. They lived amongst the Native Americans in Oklahoma and in Arizona territory and Nevada territory and in Kansas territory. And oftentimes, the violence that you would find in the West was against lawmen. That is true. And it was by the outlaws. That is true. But more often than not, it was when lawmen and their posses went to look for these outlaws. Not out of a sense of justice, but out of a sense of money. Because if they returned with them, they would get a bounty. And in fact, the most violent place of the Wild West was within 50 miles of Muskogee, Oklahoma. This was a town located in Indian territory, and it was a place that was frequented a lot by outlaws. It was also frequented by lawmen who would go there to collect bounties on those outlaws. And 50 lawmen were killed there, whether they were sheriffs or marshals. But they were killed because they were looking for people, not because they caught someone in the act of breaking the law. They got caught themselves, being somewhere where they just didn't have to be, but were. And what about that ideal that everyone in a Western town was carrying a six-shooter? Nope, sorry. That is also a myth. Guns were unbelievably expensive. In fact, looking at the cost of other goods, guns are far less expensive now than they were back then. It would have been foolish for a lot of people to buy a sidearm just to carry around on them on the day-to-day. While many people who homesteaded did have a rifle, mostly used for hunting, they wouldn't have carried a sidearm, and they wouldn't have carried that rifle with them when they went to town. In the end, there were pockets of violence, like Muskogee, Oklahoma, but these little pockets tended to be sensualized by the novels of the time, by comic books, by stories. And then those were sensualized more by movies when those came around, and we began to have this lore of the West that just isn't true. Towns of the American West were likely to be more safe than the towns of the East Coast at that time, and most large cities today. Well, you may be asking yourself, we might have got the West wrong, but at least we got the cowboys right. Nope, sorry. Our image of the American cowboy is completely wrong, starting from the top and going all the way to the bottom. Well, maybe very nearly the bottom. When you think cowboy, you probably think cowboy hat, which is likely to be the Stetson 10-gallon hat, the King of the Plains hat. And that was worn by exactly 0 cowboys. In fact, Stetson's first version of his 10-gallon hat was more like an Amish hat. It had a rounded, tall crown without a crest in the middle and a flat brim that went out to protect the wearer's face. It fit snugly on the head and helped to keep the sun and wind and rain off the wearer. But Stetson came in kind of late in the game, late in the 18th century. And the modern cowboy hat, what you think of the 10-gallon hat, was a product of the 20th century, not the 19th. In fact, if you see pictures of real cowboys, you're likely to see them wearing derby hats. Derby hats were the choice of most cowboys. The rounded crown with a slight brim around the edge, that's what most of them wore. And if you think really about actual pictures of actual cowboys, you'll realize almost none of them wore any sort of Stetson. If they didn't wear a derby hat, they may have worn something else. Billy the Kid, in his infamous picture, is wearing a top hat, although it has seen some wear and is fallen down. Wild Bill Hickok, who is probably one of the most famous cowboys, actually wore what was called a pancake hat, an American take on the sombrero. George Stetson, in his first version of his Stetson 10-gallon hat, actually was a version of a pancake hat. Something like a sombrero, something like a pancake hat, but with a little more firmness and would last a little longer. And Jesse James, the person who sent me down this little rabbit hole, well, he preferred a low crown hat with a brim that was pointed, almost like Robin Hood. Now, it is true that cowboys would basically get the hat that fit their personality and fit their needs. Many wore fur hats where there was the fur of whatever they were trapping, or a fur that afforded the level of warmth they were looking to based on where they were located or what they were doing. As Montgomery Ward's catalog took off, they would actually make a hat to your specifications. How tall do you want the crown? How do you want it shaped? How tall do you want the brim? How much of a ledge on the brim? And eventually the Stetson Company popularized what we think of cowboy hats today, but not until the 20th century. But we did get one thing right. If it wasn't the hat And by the way, it wasn't the outfit. Cowboys didn't wear jeans. That wasn't really even a thing until the end of the 19th century as well. But the one thing we know for sure about the West that is actually true is the cowboy boot. Cowboys wore boots that were similarly in shape and size and look as the boots you see today, as the ones we see in movies, and they were the same all the way back to the 16th century. In fact, you can trace the cowboy boot back to the vaquero tradition from Spain that was transported over to the Americas through their colonization. Generally, it was a cowhide footwear with a pointed toe and a high heel, and it had a space in between the ball of the foot and the heel. This allowed for proper riding technique. The pointed toe allowed it to go into the stirrup, and the space between the heel and the ball of the foot allowed to hold the stirrup firmly. And Spanish soldiers who were cavaliers wore this type of boot. The cowboys who then rode horses on the plains wore this kind of boot. And it actually became part of the culture not because it was a look, but because of its functionality. Also, the high ankle, almost up to the knee of the boot, would protect the wearer for many things. Anything you might find out on the trail, up to and including the possible snake bite. So don't be fooled by what you see in movies and TV. The cowboy wasn't the cowboy that you saw. He was something much different. Good afternoon. It is October 7th, 2020, and this is episode 37 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. Last time we talked about the Old West. Now I want to turn to something else that movies have given us a somewhat inaccurate, but also kind of more accurate picture of over the history of the world, and that is pirates. Now, of course, when I say pirates, most of you are thinking of the swashbuckling pirates of the Pirates of the Caribbean type. And that was absolutely a type of pirate that has existed, but the history of pirates goes way back before then and actually continues way after. So let's dissect some of the things you know for sure about pirates and maybe add a few more things on it. First, picture in your head what a pirate looks like. You probably see someone with flourish clothing and some jewelry, maybe a parrot on his shoulder. Actually, most of these things are true. Pirates did wear gold jewelry of many types, and it was oftentimes that they would hold on to their ill-gotten gains in the form of jewelry because it's something they could transport with them wherever they go, and they could easily turn that back into cash of a sort if they needed to in a moment's notice. It would be really hard to carry around, a gold bar or coins, and coins could be easily stolen. Much harder to take a necklace or jewelry like rings or an earring. And in fact, the earring may be the most common item amongst our depictions of pirates. And the funny thing is, that's actually true as well. Why did pirates wear earrings? Well, there were several reasons. Number one, there was a belief that the pressure on the earlobe actually stopped seasickness. So they actually wore earrings to maintain pressure on their earlobe to avoid seasickness. More importantly, there was another belief amongst the pirates that wearing gold jewelry, especially a gold earring, was a talisman against drowning. So even if they did end up in the water, they wouldn't drown. Well, what about the clothing and the parrot on the shoulder? Well, not every pirate had a parrot. And not every pirate wore the same kind of clothing. But part of being a pirate was the lore that surrounded you, much like being an outlaw in the Wild West. And if you could become known for something, then that name might precede you. And one of the important things about being a pirate was that you were always the underdog. Now, we'll get into this in a bit, but they would have many less men than people thought, and they would have much smaller ships than people thought. So if you could say, hey, remember that pirate that wore the bright red hat and had the parrot on his shoulder? That guy is not to be trifled with. Well, if you see a guy pull up next to you and he has a bright red hat and a parrot, well, you're more likely to give up rather than try and fight him. The same could be said for jewelry or any type of clothing or anything that you could think of as kind of part of that pirate mystique. Not everyone had it. And sometimes we've taken little items from different people and thrown them all together into this one hodgepodge of a pirate, when it was really one item on one person. So one guy may have a parrot, and another may wear a bright red tricord hat. Another may have several really fluffy shirts on. That was their mystique, and that's how they became known. Blackbeard, for instance, would put lit fuses in his beard. One, to draw your attention to his beard, and also so that people thought he was crazy, and a crazy person is capable of anything. You're more likely to give up and not fight them. And why was that so important? Well, in movies and television, we show pirates as oftentimes being even-handed with whatever ships they're taking over. So there would be a galleon with 300 men on it, and that was a member of the Royal Navy, and then a pirate ship, also a galleon with 300 pirates on it, would pull up next to it, and then they would jump across and a big battle would ensue. But that was not the case. It's true the treasure ships would often be large galleons with 3 or 4 masts, but most of the space on the ship was for treasure. And oftentimes there would be men 20, 50, maybe at max 100 men on the ship. That may not seem like a lot, but compare that to the pirates. They wanted a ship that was fast, so instead of getting 3 or 4 masts, they would get a much smaller ship that had 1 or 2 masts, and they would over-rig the ship, meaning they'd put more sails on it than it was designed for. More sails, meaning you catch more wind, meaning you travel faster. Also, the smaller ship was lighter, which would help it travel faster. They'd also want a ship with a shallow draft, meaning that it didn't sink as deep in the water. That would help them escape if they were being chased. They could go into a lagoon or into a river where bigger ships couldn't follow them. And although 20, 50, or 100 men on a regular treasure galleon may not seem like a lot, oftentimes a pirate would have 10 or 12 men on his ship. And if he could get that other ship to surrender easily, it would be much better off for him. There were pirates who amassed large crews, but instead of jamming them on a big ship like a galleon, they would oftentimes put them on smaller ships so that they could get there fast and overwhelm the number of people on the ship they were trying to capture. So in fact, you may have had 20 or 30 men on a very large ship, and a much smaller ship pulls up next to it, but the deck is packed with men, with pirates, and they scramble aboard, overwhelming in force the number of people you have, even though they came from a much smaller ship. And it would be rare that there would ever be an exchange of cannon fire between these two ships. That would be the absolute worst thing that the pirates could do. They would overwhelm by psychological use and numbers. Get up next to the ship, or get it to capitulate first, and then get aboard as fast as possible. And what flag would they be flying on that schooner, that 1 or 2 masted ship? You might think it's a black Jolly Roger flag. It's a skull with crossed swords underneath. Well, the Jolly Roger flag actually comes from the Joli Roger, which is French, and it basically came from having a flag that was all red. Having an all red flag or an all black flag would mean you are willing to fight to the death. And oftentimes, a royal flag, a royal British or Spanish ship would raise a red or a black flag as the pirates were incoming to let them know, we may be 50, but we will fight to the death for this ship. Sometimes it would save the ship. The most ruthless pirates, however, wouldn't care. They would go in for the kill, and then if it cost them all of their men and their own ship, they would take that risk. Now, while the violence may have been upplayed in movies and TV for the Wild West, it was not for pirates. They lived a very violent life. They survived on taking what they could get and getting away fast. This often meant very violent fights on the decks of ships that they tried to take, and oftentimes it meant killing most or all of the crew. Although the best pirates would always leave one man alive to escape in a lifeboat to let others know how his life was ruined and his ship taken by, enter name of pirate here. Whoever it was, they want them to know. They want lore to grow around their name so that everyone knows to be scared of them. We also think about pirates as something that came out of the era of the 1600s, maybe the early 1700s. And that is true. That was the golden age of piracy, when the Spanish treasure galleons were going from the New World back to Spain, when the British were setting up colonies all over the Caribbean and the Americas, when the French were in the Americas as well. Basically, it meant that there were a lot of ships and there was a lot of treasure moving around and a lot of opportunity to make money. But we can trace pirates all the way back to essentially when men first took to ships. When the first guy put to sea to honest work, shortly thereafter, someone put to sea to take it from him. In fact, the Phoenicians, who were known as civilization builders later in their time period, started out as pirates. And in Greece, piracy was a legitimate profession. you could be a well-rounded member of society and still be a pirate. And piracy continued all throughout history. We think of piracy as maybe a pre-American thing, but one of the first wars that America fought was against the Barbary pirates in North Africa. And it wasn't really a war that we fought. It was a naval interaction, happened mostly in the Atlantic, some in the Mediterranean Sea. We actually did send some Marines over to the Barbary coast, and that's included in their fight song. But the American government waged war on a pirate state. That happened. And it didn't stop there. In fact, piracy continued through the 1800s, the 1900s, and even up until today. The place where it happens may change. The people who are being pirates may change, but piracy remains the same. In the 1600s and early 1700s, treasure was in the New World and it was being taken from there to Europe. Now, treasure is in the form of oil in the Middle East and being taken from there to the United States, to the West, and to Europe. And piracy is pretty common in the Indian Ocean and off the Horn of Africa. It has also been true that a commonality throughout history that the taking of captives and the ransoming of those captives have been a part of piracy forever, and that remains a part of piracy today. In fact, other than the oil pirates, the second most common type of piracy is the taking of cruise ships in that same area of the Indian Ocean, holding them for ransom, and then once the ransom is paid, releasing them. Entire towns and parts of countries are built around the economy of ransom. And in fact, while Hollywood has gotten correct the appearance and the actions of pirates from the 16 and 1700s, it also has pretty accurately represented pirates from more recent times as well. The movie Captain Phillips shows modern-day pirates taking over a ship, and it is a pretty accurate representation of that action. So while they may have missed the mark about cowboys and the Wild West, they're actually pretty on point when it comes to pirates. Good afternoon, it's October 8th, 2020, and this is episode 38 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob, thanks for joining me. So I wanted to take a step away from the series of episodes that I've been doing because something has come up in the news that I just feel like needs to be addressed because a lot of people are confused about it. If you live in Los Angeles like I do, or in any city that has a lot of Armenian population, you're probably wondering why you've seen a lot of Armenian people out protesting, maybe even blocking highways like they have been here in LA. Well, the reason is because of the flare-up of hostilities in the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan and Armenia, otherwise known as the Republic of Artsakh. Now, I am going to warn you from the beginning, my pronunciation here is going to be terrible. I cannot read Cyrillic, and a lot of Armenian writing is very similar to Cyrillic. I don't speak Armenian, I don't speak Azerbaijani, I don't speak Turkish or Iranian or Russian or any of those things. So I'm going to mispronounce a lot of the words. I apologize. I'm doing my best. So I have looked up a lot of the pronunciations and hopefully I won't do too terribly on that front. So this problem, as many problems, can be traced back to the West and the East breaking up the world into little fiefdoms. Much like the area of the world that was formerly known as Yugoslavia, the area now surrounding Armenia and Azerbaijan and the Republic of Artsakh was kept under control for a long period of time by the forces of the Soviet Union. But tensions between different ethnic groups and different religions in this area run deep and they run a long time. I won't be able to go into all of the details. This is a very complicated issue. I'm going to stick to basically the 20th century and what's happened recently. But I want to start out this episode with making a very clear statement that there is undeniable evidence that in the early 1900s, between 1912 and 1914, the forces of the Ottoman Empire absolutely committed a genocide against the Armenian people. And to do or to say anything otherwise would be categorically false. The Armenian genocide actually occurred, and we must embrace that fact as a fact of life from the beginning. And I think that that is important to note because of the way that things have broken down in this area since the removal of the forces of the Ottoman Empire. The people of Armenia, people who are natively, ethnically Armenian, are also kind of natively Russian. These are people, Slavic people who come from Russia, the Caucasus Mountains. The people of Azerbaijan are ethnically Azerbaijani, and they're ethnically more of the Middle East area. Religiously, Armenians are generally Christian, and Azerbaijani is majority Muslim. And in fact, the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic was the first Muslim majority democratic republic that was established, and it was established with a Western style government rather than a caliphate style government at the time. But Nagorno-Karabakh is a disputed area. It is an area that lies between the eastern border of Armenia and the western border of Azerbaijan. It is internationally recognized as part of the territory of Azerbaijan, but after a valiant struggle for independence between 1992 and 1994, the area was basically let go by Azerbaijan, and it ruled itself autonomously as the Republic of Artsakh. And it was given a lot of support by the people of Armenia. The people who live in Nagorno-Karabakh are actually ethnically Armenian. They speak Armenian. They use the Armenian dram as their currency, and a lot of their military forces and are made up of Armenians, as well as their economy relies heavily on Armenia. And as I said, this area of the world is very complicated. While Azerbaijan lies furthest to the east, then the Republic of Artsakh, and then Armenia, there is an area to the west of Armenia that is theoretically and internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. This area is known as the Enclave of Nakhchivan, and it is, again, lying to the west of all of these other areas. Much like many of the provinces in this part of the world, it operates as the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic, which is theoretically separate. They did claim independence, but is internationally recognized again as part of Azerbaijan. To the south of this region is Iran, to the west of this region is Turkey, and to the north is Russia. So now that you kind of have the lay of the land, let's go back to the very beginning. This area, again, was under the influence of the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, an agreement was reached that the Ottoman Empire would vacate the area, and it would be overseen by the British as part of that division of the Middle East. British forces met with some resistance from Russian forces, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution, which again occurred during World War I, but they got themselves organized and they started organizing their internal republics for the Soviet Union. And this area was actually incorporated into the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic. Similarly, Armenia was one of the founding members of the Soviet Union as part of the Transcaucasian Soviet Socialist Republic. After those larger republics were broken down, it became known as the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic and entered in as a full Union member. And that is basically where things remained frozen. There was the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic and the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. But even at that time, the ethnic majority in Nagorno-Karabakh believed that they should be part of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, not the Azerbaijani one. And the Muslim majority in the enclave believed that they should be part of the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic, not the Armenian Socialist Republic. But they were divided by land and there was no way to reach it. In 1991, as the Soviet Union began to break up, the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic declared independence, as did the Armenians. And of course, this disputed area became a powder keg for a growing conflict between the now independent Azerbaijan and Armenia. And in fact, the area of Nagorno-Karabakh actually declared independence from the greater Azerbaijan and created what was, in effect, a civil war within the country. That war simmered beyond the greater Armenian and Azerbaijani conflict, even into 1994, when a ceasefire was eventually called, and basically the lines stood where they stood on that day. Thanks to some gains by the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, the Republic essentially had expanded their stronghold, and once the ceasefire went into effect, they began essentially autonomous rule, although again with a lot of help from Armenia. At that point, it remained basically frozen. They call these areas frozen conflict zones. There are a lot of them in the former Soviet Union. You may have heard of Chechnya. That is another one that is claimed by one country but wants to be independent, and a ceasefire essentially holds the area as not quite independent recognized internationally as being part of a country, but that country does not have any authority over it. And that ceasefire from 1994 that was meant to be temporary caused over 500,000 Azerbaijanis to flee the area and move to Greater Azerbaijan. And they were replaced in some way by ethnic Armenians who moved from Armenia into the Nagorno-Karabakh area. But this area isn't great for settling. It's in the Caucasus Mountains. It's very mountainous. It doesn't have a lot of resources other than oil. And obviously, as you probably know, oil can cause a lot of conflicts. It's not great for farming, and the economy is reliant in major part on Armenia. But thanks to the efforts of the United States in the post-Cold War area, as well as the Russian Republic, the Russian Federation, and the Turkish authorities in the area, basically a tripartite action in the area, kept the peace. The Russians have always backed the Armenians, the Turks have always backed the Azerbaijanis, and the United States was able to come in and try to keep everyone calm. And those other world powers also tried to keep the local authorities calmer and stop a conflict from breaking out. However, the last major American effort to be involved in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict was 20 years ago. We invited all those parties to come to the U.S., to Florida, and they met, although no agreement was able to be reached. And shortly thereafter, 9/11 kind of took this area off the importance table, and we started to ignore it, and we focused on the GWAT, the Global War on Terror. And for a time, the Turks and the Russians were able to maintain a peace in the area. However, much like the United States and the Soviet Union before it, the Turks and the Russians have now gotten into proxy wars in other places that threaten in ways to flame up the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. In the first place, Turkey bought equipment from Russia, anti-aircraft missiles, rather than the typical American equipment that they had been buying. Turkey has always been a strong American ally. In fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis was settled by the removal of American missiles, Jupiter missiles, from Turkey, and we replaced those by selling them F-16s and other equipment. And they also cut a gas pipeline deal that was seen as undermining Ukraine, a strong ally for Russia. So they seem to be moving into the Russian sphere, if we think of the world as spheres between Russia and the United States. But at the same time, their forces in Syria came into conflict with Russian-supported forces. And in fact, a Russian airstrike killed some Turkish soldiers earlier this year. And that seemed to turn the tide of this growing Turkey-Russia relationship. At that point, proxy fighters for Turkey in Syria actually began engaging with the Russian-backed fighters and with Russian advisors who were there on the ground. Then Turkish-backed fighters from Syria actually went into Libya and backed the UN-created government there against Russian factions that have been trying to make moves in the area. So this sets the table for the Nagorno-Karabakh area to be a direct conflict, although in the form of a proxy war, between Turkey and Russia. The Armenians claim that a Turkish F-16 actually shot down an Armenian jet during this growing conflict, although Turkey does deny those claims. Armenia also claims that Turkey has, as they did in Syria and in Libya, dispatched militants from Syria to the Nagorno-Karabakh area, and that they are there fighting on behalf of Azerbaijanis. And that report, coupled with the report of the Turkish F-16 shooting down an Armenian jet, led the Russians in their parliament to announce that they were considering sending in Russian troops directly as peacekeepers in the Nagorno-Karabakh area. Now, of course, a lot of times countries will send in troops under the auspices of being peacekeepers, but in the end, the Russian troops may face off with Turkish troops, Russians and Armenians versus Turkish and Azerbaijanis. And another unknown in this conflict is that Iran shares a border with both Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the Nagorno-Karabakh area is just shortly off their border as well. So there's a chance that Iran will also get involved in this conflict. They have had joint military exercises with the Armenians and also separately with the Azerbaijanis. It doesn't seem as though they might pick a side, but if someone does invade their airspace, it could cause a problem. And in fact, they said just this week that they had shot down an Azerbaijani helicopter and the debris came down inside of Iran. So it's likely that that helicopter had violated their airspace. Now, all of this started about a week ago. Although the conflict has been simmering, as I pointed out, for a long time now, there hasn't been a lot of strategic importance to this area. But now with Russia and Turkey seeming to want to find a proxy war to meet in, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict may have greater importance on the global geopolitical stage. And this is, of course, all set by the tone that the United States has developed of being hands-off in areas of the world where it had once established its dominance. And with the absence of hegemony, other factors, other countries will likely step up and try to fill that power vacuum. The latest conflict began back on September 27th. Azerbaijan claims that Armenia shelled its positions in the Nagorno-Karabakh area or just inside of Azerbaijan. Again, internationally, the area is recognized as part of Azerbaijan. Armenia claims that the Azerbaijanis went on offensive without provocation and invaded essentially this autonomous region that is under the protection of Armenia. And thus far, about 150 people or more have been killed. But there have been direct conflicts between the forces of Armenia and the forces of Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous zone. So what will happen in the future? No one really knows. A best case scenario may be that the tensions calm, that all forces return to the ceasefire lines. Armenian forces return to Armenia, Azerbaijani to Azerbaijan, and that the Nagorno-Karabakh forces are allowed to retain their territory. And that would have mean that all of this conflict, all of this bloodshed was essentially for nothing. This could bring everyone back to the table so that they will eventually consider some sort of land swap, bringing the Nagorno-Karabakh area into Greater Armenia in exchange for some land given to Azerbaijan. Although that's not likely. That was on the table in the last negotiations that the U.S. tried to hold, and no one would agree to that. And of course, worst case scenario is that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict draws Russia and Turkey into a wider war, that this entire region of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russia, Turkey, and even possibly Iran are drawn into an area-wide conflict that is essentially an open war between the sides of Russia and Armenia, Azerbaijan and Turkey, and perhaps Iran as a third party or taking one side with the other. Likely Turkey and Azerbaijan, as they are all Muslim majority countries. And of course, the country of Turkey, the Turks there, are the current incarnation in the minds of many Armenians of the Ottomans who carried out the Armenian genocide. So there is a lot of emotion and history all packed up in this powder keg that threatens to erupt into a greater conflict that could involve many other countries in the world. Now, I am not one to say how the conflict began. Obviously, I'm not one who's on the ground, but that is the history of the conflict in the area and where it stands now. If you see ethnically Armenian people protesting or being out in the streets, getting visibility about this, that is why, because Armenia is on the verge of being drawn into a greater conflict against Azerbaijan in support of the people in the Nagorno-Karabakh area. And also, they are obviously upset about the loss of life thus far. And in some respects, they are looking to get the attention of people in the United States. And they are asking the same question that was asked at the debate several times. What does the vacuum of the United States leaving the world stage cause? And this is one of those causes. But we will keep an eye on this situation, and if there are any updates in the future, I'll be sure to bring that to you on a future episode. Good afternoon. It is October 9th, 2020, and this is episode 39 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. Continuing with the theme from yesterday, I wanted to talk about another often rumored but actually true story from history, a myth that isn't a myth, it's fact. And that is, of course, the fact of the Chemist War. Now, a period of U.S. history that is particularly embarrassing is the period of Prohibition. From 1920 until 1933, alcohol was constitutionally outlawed in the United States, thanks to the efforts of the teetotalers and the somewhat progressives. They call themselves progressives. And the Chemist War was a small part of the effort of the U.S. government to fight against the desire of the American public for illegal alcohol. Now, you may know some facts from the story of Prohibition, mainly that The mafia and other crime groups gained power and prevalence during this period. When alcohol was not available legally, people were going to find it, and the mafia and other criminal groups were more than happy to make it available. During the early years of Prohibition, between 1920 and 1925, there were oftentimes stories of people getting sick, and alcohol poisoning happened relatively regularly. This is because after the stores of alcohol ran out that had already been produced before Prohibition, but couldn't be produced after, people started making alcohol in their own stills and essentially bathtubs. These often weren't produced under sterile proceedings, and it could lead to any number of different sicknesses depending on whether metal leached into the liquid, whether the mixing was improper, or if the process was rushed in order to get product out to sell. But in 1926, doctors started noticing a rash of different kinds of sickness. This was beyond regular alcohol poisoning, which we think of today as just drinking too much alcohol, but at that time it had a much different meaning. It actually meant getting sick from the alcohol you were drinking. And while metals mixed in the alcohol or an improper fermentation technique had certain pitfalls and obviously illness could result, this was something unlike they had ever seen. It seemed to be intentional poisoning. And it was. While alcohol as a drink had been outlawed by Prohibition, there are several industries that use alcohol as cleaning solvents and other industrialized uses. What bootleggers quickly learned is that you could take industrialized alcohol and, through some very simple proceedings, make it drinkable. It may not taste very good, but after all, it was alcohol, and that was the important thing. The government, having learned this, turned to their chemist and said, "Give us a solution to stop this." And the chemists did. They had their own little war during Prohibition. They did this by purposefully poisoning industrial alcohols. Now, it didn't stop it from serving its purpose of cleaning or lubricating, whatever it may have been, but what it did do is, if ingested, terminally poison the person ingesting it. The idea was not to protect people, the idea was to scare people. Not to scare people who had ingested alcohol because they would die from what they had ingested, but to scare others into not drinking any alcohol because who knows if this would be a poison batch. And from 1926 through the end of Prohibition in 1933, there was a continuous program of poisoning industrial alcohols. This led to the death of at least 10,000 Americans, poisoned by their own government intentionally, fully knowing that death would be the result. Now, this dark chapter of Prohibition is mostly forgotten. We think of G-men fighting mafia types, gun battles across Model T Fords, racing through the streets of Chicago and New York and Philadelphia. This is a darker part of that history. In fact, the medical examiner for New York City in the 1920s called Prohibition and the Chemist War the national experiment in extermination. Very telling, since just a decade later, we would go fight a war to stop another national experiment in extermination. And I can already hear some people that I know saying, "Hey, this is why I don't drink. I just smoke marijuana." Well, during the 1970s, the U.S. government had a program to spray Mexican marijuana fields, Mexico is the number one grower of marijuana, with a chemical called paraquat, which was an herbicide. Now, this would generally destroy crops, but it may not destroy all the crops in the field. And the U.S. government knew that whatever crop survived would be harvested and would be sold and would be used, mainly by Americans. But if those crops had been sprayed with paraquat, even if they hadn't died, they would become poisonous. And because of the nature of the market, what is grown in one field may be mixed together with what is grown in another field. And the ability to poison is retained and spread. But the government, similar to Prohibition in the 1930s, believed that the fear of dying from smoking tainted marijuana might stop people from using marijuana. It was an acceptable collateral damage. More importantly, during the Chemist War of Prohibition and the paraquat experiment in the 1970s, if citizens ended up poisoning themselves, even to the point of death, well, they brought it on themselves. That was the government's position. We're not killing you with our chemicals. You're killing you. Unsurprisingly, Once the government program in the 70s was revealed, it was quickly stopped based on the results of the earlier Prohibition Chemist War. So once again, when you see people around you saying, "How can we trust the government? They say this product is fine and they want me to use it, but they have poisoned us before. Maybe this is poison." And you dismiss it offhand, just remember, the American government has absolutely and purposefully poisoned its citizens before. And I'm not even talking about Agent Orange in Vietnam. This is alcohol right at home. Good afternoon. It is October 10th, 2020, and this is episode 40 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. So I will continue to mix in some true myths, along with our regular myths and facts and regular episodes as we move forward. But for today, I wanted to wrap on this set of absolutely true facts that we may think of as myths or may have thought of as myths in the past. And I'm relating this to the current COVID crisis and why people may not trust what their government is telling them. Most specifically, this was spawned by a couple of conversations I had regarding the vaccine program that is likely coming once we have a 1 or 2 or 5 working vaccines. And I did get into a bit of an argument in a Facebook comments section where I saw someone say, well, why would the government use a vaccine program for anything bad? It's only helpful. Well, let's talk about that, shall we? Because the CIA actually used a fake vaccine program in order to hunt down and kill Osama bin Laden. Here's how it happened. The CIA had actually tracked a known al-Qaeda courier to a certain area of the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. That means that they knew that bin Laden was somewhere in the area. However, they didn't know exactly where, which household he was in. But they knew if they could get some DNA from someone in the house and match it to Osama bin Laden's sister, who had died in Boston in 2010, that they would know which house Osama bin Laden was in, because his children would be in the same house. And I'm using the term house here, but in reality, in this part of the country, a house was really a compound, or several houses grouped together with an outer wall. So the CIA recruited a Pakistani doctor who was in charge of an area that ran directly along the border with Afghanistan. He put up some posters about a free vaccination program for hepatitis B. Some money has been brought in. We're able to give free vaccines to everyone. All you have to do is come and sign in, and then we give you the vaccine. Now, it's important to note here that the hepatitis B vaccine is given in 3 injections. The first, then a second, usually a month later, and then a third. Most of the people who would have been hiding out with Osama bin Laden, and in fact most people in the area, knew of Western medicine and knew that this was a very important vaccine for their children to receive, but because of the access to the medicine in the area, they hadn't been able to get it. So many people signed up for this vaccine program. And to say again, it was a fake vaccine program. It did not exist. The children were injected with something in the first time, but it is likely that the second injection or the third injection, rather than giving them a vaccine, was actually an effort to draw blood. Now, this could have been several different ways, either just taking blood and telling them that was the second treatment, or by withdrawing some blood after giving them the second dose of the vaccine. There are any number of ways that this can be done, but in any event, blood was drawn from every child who participated in the vaccine. Now, what about the success of this operation? Well, first of all, the only person who knew about the operation was the doctor who organized it. All of the people on the ground, the ones actually giving the vaccine, and assertively the ones who drew the blood, were not told of its true purpose. In fact, there was a particular nurse who was invited out to a group of compounds that are specifically protected, and those residents didn't want to come out to the clinic. She went in and she did her job as it had been outlined to her. These poor people were unwilling accomplices to the CIA's plot. It has been said afterward by sources in the know that it was unsuccessful. They were unable to actually find any DNA match to bin Laden. However, shortly after this program wrapped, we then went in, found Osama bin Laden in his compound, and took him out. So saying that it was unsuccessful seems a bit disingenuous. And what happened to those unwitting participants? Well, most, if not all of them, were arrested by the ISI, which is the internal FBI service for Pakistan. They were interrogated. Some of them had charges brought against them for spying because, even inadvertently, they were spies for the CIA. And it nearly caused an international incident between the United States and Pakistan. But we got our man, and that's really what's important, isn't it? So when you see someone discussing a US-backed vaccine program, and one side says, I would never trust them, and the other side says, you can always trust them, just remember, nothing is absolute. Maybe there are situations where you can. After all, the U.S. almost single-handedly, through its efforts, has eliminated polio from the face of the earth, and smallpox, and other really horrible diseases. However, we have also used vaccination programs for illicit purposes that may or may not have actually protected the people who thought they were being protected. So, flip a coin? Thank you for joining me for this episode of Rob Explains. Look for new episodes daily wherever you listen to podcasts, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. Do you have a subject you'd like me to cover, or just looking for more Rob Explains? Find us online on all social media at Rob Explains. Got a comment, question, or query? Or did I get something wrong and you want to correct me? Shoot me an email, rob@robexplains.com, or you can leave a comment down below. I'll check those right after the show goes live. And you can send me a message, anchor.fm/RobExplains/message. And in the form of a voicemail, I can actually include it in a future episode. Once again, thank you for joining me. Until next time, this is Rob. Take care of yourselves and each other. Have a great day.